Welcome to the Fungi Lab. So I'm going to start out and just give a quick overview of what we're trying to accomplish in this lab. We're going to be talking about fungi and its various roles, mainly about how it relates to decomposition and its involvement in symbiotic relationships. We'll also be looking at a lot of representatives of fruiting bodies of fungi. So Scott could tell us a little bit about the symbiosis, just a preview of that.
Yeah, so fungi, and there might be as many as 5 million different species of fungi within the biosphere. They're really masters at relationships with other organisms and with other fungi. And those relationships we can categorize as the different types of symbiosis. That would include things like parasitism, where one partner is benefiting to the detriment of the other partner in the relationship. Also, commensalism is another type of symbiosis where one partner in the relationship is benefiting and the other one is unharmed. And also mutualistic symbiosis, where both partners are benefiting from the relationship. And that's really the type of symbiosis that we usually think of, mutualistic symbiosis, but it does include all those three categories.
To me, one of the really cool things about fungi is their growth form. And they have this filamentous growth form, which means that they're going to look like little tiny strands, and then those can be thick enough that they're called a mycelium. So you can see the individual filaments, the hyphae or the mycelium, depending upon where you might be looking. And so I wanted to show you that, because one of the common places you can find this is either in leaf litter or on logs, and that's talked about on page 2. So here we have a log, and I'm going to turn it over so we can get a chance to see what this looks like. Here on the log you can see some white coloration, and even though it doesn't necessarily all look filamentous, this would be a mycelium, a fungal mycelium. And where that was in contact with the leaf litter, you can see a little bit what looks like a little bit more of a filamentous growth form here. And so these fungal cells potentially would be carrying out decomposition, releasing enzymes onto this dead organic matter and absorbing the simple compounds that are resulting from that. So on page 2 it talks about the fact that decomposition is a very important process that fungi carry out and helps release nutrients back into the soil so that they can be taken up by plants again. And that's one very, very critical role that fungi play in ecosystems. And in addition to that, on page 1 it talks about how there is the fruiting body that's produced specifically for the release of spores. And typically those spores are coming about through sexual reproduction, but there are also fungi that are reproducing asexually, and we may say a little bit more about that later. So when you think of a mushroom, we'll be looking at those later, think about that as being a place where the spores are being produced and released. So I wanted to point out, we found some fruiting bodies here that are just pushing up out of the ground. So if we look here, we can see these nice fruiting bodies of a club fungus. I can see that they're gilled mushrooms, and so since the fruiting bodies are being produced by the mycelium of this mushroom, one thing that I wanted to be sure and have you thinking about is that whenever you see fruiting bodies like this, you should think about the fact that the mycelium is all underneath there. So it's possible that the mycelium that is attached to these fruiting bodies might be attached to this tree, or it might be underneath several of these plants that are around here. So the mycelium is going to be all underneath where you see these fruiting bodies. Here we have a really nice example of a fruiting body of Basidiomycete, a club fungus. So I wanted to pick up this fruiting body so I could just highlight the features or the structures that are on page 7. So you can kind of see the gills from this angle. You can see the stalk, obviously, and then the top of the fungus, and this one is pretty flat. But here, look at these beautiful gills. So in lab, we have a prepared slide that allows you to actually see a cross-section of a single gill, and that's where you would be able to see the structure, the club-shaped structure that is producing the spores. So the spores themselves are microscopic, and we wouldn't be able to see the structure that's producing them, but those club-like structures are going to be lining both sides of each one of these gills. So think about each club-like structure producing 4 spores, and each gill here would be lined with thousands of those club-shaped structures, and you can sort of start to think about how many spores this single fruiting body then would be able to produce. This is a beautiful specimen.
So down here we see some really prominent mushrooms, and I dug down into the earth a little bit just to show you that underneath this fruiting body mushroom would be a whole network of subterranean hyphae. Those hyphae again are bundling together to form mycelia, and they form a network within the soil. So most of the fungal life cycle is actually underground, and we just see a glimpse of it when we see these mushrooms. So we saw some examples of the more typical gilled mushrooms that occur on the forest floor. What we're looking at now is a totally different main category of fungi that are also very common, but they commonly occur, like you see here, on trees. And these are called shelf fungi, so called because they form almost like a little shelf here on the tree. These fungi also have networks of hyphae. In this case, instead of going down into the soil, they're penetrating into the structure of the tree. Side note is that fungi actually are one of the only organisms that can break down lignin, which is a major structural component of trees. So that's part of the reason they can live in a place like this. But the main differentiator with these shelf fungi, not only is their shelf-like structure, but it's the way they make spores. So another name for these are polypores. Instead of gills, they actually have little tiny near microscopic pores on their under surface. And it's inside of those pores where the spores are produced and released, as opposed to the gills on the other mushrooms that we saw. So these are shelf fungi or polypores.
Sometimes fungi are parasitic in the sense that they are actually stealing nutrients from the organism that they are living on, to the point that they can cause what we would term a disease to happen. And so on page 6 in your handout, it talks about beech bark disease. Beech bark disease is something that's caused by a native fungus, but its prevalence increased greatly once a non-native insect was introduced into the country that helped the fungus spread. And so the fungus itself is called the nectria fungus, but there's a very tiny little insect, less than a millimeter, called a scale insect, and this was the one that was introduced. They have a piercing sucking mouth part, and so they will tap into the phloem in the tree, and they pierce through the bark in order to do that. So the fungus can gain entry to the beech tree through the hole that the insect had made when it tapped into the phloem. Then the fungus starts to grow. It also is able to parasitize the sap in the tree, and ultimately will take a toll on the tree and cause the development of this disease. So this is a beech tree that's showing some typical signs of beech bark disease. These sores, things that look like sores, they're called cankers on the beech tree, and that's something that outwardly would indicate that this tree is suffering from beech bark disease. If this goes on for long enough, it starts to weaken the structural integrity of the tree, and then sometimes you can have something called beech snap, where the tree will actually break off in the middle, which seems like kind of an odd thing to happen to a tree. We always think of trees as being nice and solid and strong. So I'm going to walk over here where you can see an example of this. So here is a beech tree that presumably was affected by beech bark disease, and then at some point it broke part way up. So this would be an example of what's called beech snap, which can sometimes be seen in trees in areas that are affected by beech bark disease. Then after that happened, this tree presumably died, and now we can see some of the another kind of fungus that's talked about at the bottom of that page. These black tarry looking structures here are being produced by a fungus that's mainly carrying out decomposition, so not being parasitic because this tree is no longer living, but another fungus has now colonized this dead organic matter. And so this was an example then of something that is, in this case, very detrimental for forests where there were a lot of beech trees and a lot of them died as a result of beach bark disease. While we're here in the beach stand, there's something else that I wanted to point out that's on the top of page 7. Sometimes you can see things that look like fungi, but they really aren't. So here we have an example of something called beach drops, and this is actually a plant that's parasitizing the roots that are in the ground here. Since it doesn't have chlorophyll, it might easily be mistaken for a fungus, but it's actually not. So I just thought I would point that out because, as the name suggests, you find it near beech trees.
So among the tremendous diversity of different types of fungi, there's fungi that don't look like ordinary mushrooms at all. One example that's pretty common in the woods around here are these jelly fungi, and these have a really kind of loose consistency or texture. If you poke them, you'll see they're very loose aggregates, and they have this bright yellow color from natural pigments that the fungi produce. So again, in the category of interesting fungi that have different kinds of growth forms, this is a little coral fungus, a little yellow coral fungus colony that we almost actually missed here on the ground. It's quite small. But this is another type of a mushroom that doesn't look like most mushrooms, but this is almost looks like an alien species, but it's right here in the Adirondack forest, and it's quite common in the woods this time of year. So another type of fungus that you find all over the forest, especially here in the Adirondacks, is lichen. And lichen is actually not just a fungus. It's actually called a composite organism. So it's literally a blend of multiple organisms that live together in a very intimate symbiosis. So here you can see this whole tree here is covered in lichen, and there's about 3,600 known species of lichen in North America alone, but new species are discovered every single year. Another thing to know about lichen is that it grows in 3 primary growth forms, and we can actually see all 3 of those growth forms right here. The first one, which is maybe the most common, is called foliose, and you can get clues to the meaning of these different growth forms just from their name. So foliose, think about foliage. These are leaf-like lichen growth forms. So you can see they're a little bit raised off the tree, but they're not too three-dimensional, and they look like leaves. That's foliose. Another growth form for lichen is called crustose. And again, just from the name, you can hear that it's a very crusty type of lichen. It almost looks like paint that's dried on the tree here. So that's a crustose growth form. The third type you will see a lot of times will just fall off of a branch out of a tree. These big clusters here, this is called fruticose lichen. It's very easy to identify as opposed to these 2 growth forms because it's so three-dimensional. So you can see this branching tubular structure and the size of this lichen, and like I said, they're so heavy that during a storm they often fall down, and you can find big chunks of lichen like this on the ground. If you were to zoom down at the microscopic level in any one of these lichens, you would see up close that symbiosis between the multiple organisms in the lichen that I described. And we'll go back in the lab and we'll take a look at a picture of that. But generally this is a fungus which makes up most of the structure of the lichen, plus either an algae species or sometimes a cyanobacteria species. The algae or the cyanobacteria is doing photosynthesis, so it's capturing energy from the sun. The fungi at the microscopic level, the fungal filaments actually wrap around those algae or cyanobacterial cells, and they absorb the nutrients that are produced by the algae. So it's a very intimate symbiosis that you can see under the microscope in this type of composite organism.
It can be challenging to find examples of the fruiting bodies of ascomycetes because they're not mushrooms like we normally think of fungi fruiting bodies as being, and a lot of them are disease causers, but there are a couple that we can consistently find in this area. And so I wanted to show you the fruiting body of what's called the black knot fungus that commonly is found on cherry trees. And so here I've got an example. This is an older specimen, and what I'm looking at is this woody growth here. If this were a fresh specimen, it would be completely black. It would look like some sticky tar on there. And the photograph that's on page 9 in your lab handout looks like that. But this one is an older one, but it does help you see how fungi can sometimes actually look very woody. They don't have to always look like a mushroom or a shelf fungus. So that also gives you a sense of the fact that fungi have lots of different growth forms in the fruiting bodies, and you can see a lot of variety in that. And having this very woody look is just one example of that kind of variety when you look across the different fruiting bodies of fungi. Here's another example of an ascomycete that I wanted to point out that's talked about in your lab handout. So there's a photo in the handout. This is the alder tongue gall, and it is these structures, these tongue-shaped structures that are growing out of this cone-like structure. So an alder is a flowering plant, so this is not an actual cone, but this is the female part of this plant where the eggs would be being produced. And that is the only place on the alder where the tongue gall will actually form its fruiting body. And the shape, the long, elongated shape, is thought to help it disperse its spores. And from what little bit I had read, there is not any major negative effect of the presence of the tongue gall on the alder. But this is where you would see it, is just when you look at the female structures on an alder. And alders are shrubs that you can find along wet areas all around campus. The other structures that you see on the alder here are where the pollen is produced, and the tongue gall does not grow on that.
So another main category of fungi in the forest is actually almost completely invisible to our eye as we walk through the forest. And part of that is the mystery and the wonder of this type of fungus called mycorrhizal fungi. These mycorrhizal fungi live in association with plants. So we talked about the different types of symbiosis. These are typically in a mutualistic symbiosis with a plant. And where you would find them is more at the microscopic level, surrounding the roots of many different types of plants in the forest. So if we were to look down at this root under the microscope, we would see that there's fungal hyphae associated and attached, physically attached to these roots that are exchanging nutrients with the plant. These are called mycorrhiza, and there's actually miles and miles of these mycorrhizal fungal networks underneath the forest everywhere that we walk.